Alright, chat, we got why George Janko hates Logan Paul, and I know y'all seen that interview of that one time with Bobby Lee, and that was probably one of the best interviews of my life right there. But let's get into the video.
George Janko has completely cut ties with Logan Paul and the Impulsive podcast. After countless episodes spent in silence, having his jokes shut down by guests, and even leaving in the middle of an episode, George's relationship with the Impulsive podcast, and more specifically Logan Paul and Mike Majlak, has come to an end. However, George's departure wasn't a quick one. Instead, it was marked by little clues, some were obvious than others, such as him unfollowing both Logan and Mike on their socials, and the Impulsive logo on all major platforms, now excluding George. George wouldn't come out with a proper announcement until January of this year, where he proudly launched his own podcast, in which he assured all his fans that he wouldn't be leaving
His podcast isn't even that bad,
however,
to be honest.
George would start appearing less and less in episodes until eventually disappearing from Logan's podcast altogether. It wouldn't be long until fans began noticing that something was wrong, leading George to finally post a tweet on April 2023. "I wasn't going to talk, but now I am." This small statement would make listeners speculate that a potential rift had formed between George and his fellow hosts. A few days later, George would go on to confirm this on his new personal podcast alongside his guest Tana Mojo, where both of them would joke about creating a podcast together.
This is your garbage trash
Bro,
browser.
ad
And this is
already.
Opera GX. you see this difference?
It was here that George began to make subtle references to his time in the Impulsive podcast.
Watch out, Logan. Watch out, Mike.
Just do me a favor. Put me in a spot where no one looks at me or talks to me so I feel like
Absolutely.
how I used to feel.
Now, what could have pushed George to the brink like this? Well, to understand, we need to go back to episode 351 of the Impulsive podcast. In this episode, Logan had comedian Bobby Lee as a guest. Bobby Lee's unique comedic approach, characterized by
That's what I was
pushing
just
limits and
talking
defying
about.
conventions, was expected to create a really interesting, impulsive episode, as his fans and followers were well aware. True to his comedic style, he maintained his witty
That
charm,
was
fearlessly
so
challenging the
funny.
boundaries and stretching the podcast's age appropriateness to its limits. However, as the
What's he
podcast
doing?
unfolded, it became evident that George, who had been the target of numerous jokes during the show, had finally reached his threshold. After sharing a particularly sensitive story about his religion, one of the hardest moments of his life, and how this was the first time he was sharing this publicly, little did he know that this would become the biggest mistake of the podcast.
For 2 years of my life recently was the hardest years of my life. I gained 40 pounds of weight. Honestly, if I was not Christian, I'd probably be suicidal. And it was really, really bad. I never told anybody about it. I just couldn't understand why I got everything that I've ever prayed for, but yet I was so unbelievably depressed.
Bobby would end up retorting with a joke, while shutting down every comedic response George would make in return.
It was a long monologue.
He was just waiting.
Let me just say something. I love what you were saying. It was very long.
From this point forward, George could be seen getting quieter and quieter, and letting his other
Man.
co-hosts handle Bobby, very rarely adding to the conversation. On top of this, Bobby's seating position could be seen as more unassociated with George, with his back turned and only facing Logan and Mike. However, it's only when Logan points out how clocked out George is that he finally walks off the podcast without saying goodbye.
There was certain.
He is clocked out.
Yeah,
he's-
I know.
George has been under a tremendous amount of abuse.
No,
No, stop, George. I want you over here with me. George, I want you over here with me. Chase him down. Go. You find him. George, no, go get him. Go get him. I said.
Bobby criticized George as being unprofessional for his decision to leave the podcast so abruptly, and even
That is
Logan appeared
unprofessional.
frustrated over George walking out. In contrast, Mike displayed empathy and support, revealing a side of him that many fans were pleasantly surprised with. Still, this wouldn't be enough to de-escalate the situation. Despite Logan and Mike's repeated attempts to coax George back, he remained absent from the rest of the recording. As the podcast drew to a close, Lee began asking George's fans for forgiveness, and that he'd come back in the future to properly apologize to George. In the subsequent episode of Impulsive, George took the opportunity to apologize for his exit and address his relationship with Bobby Lee, saying that both of them had since forgiven each other. This was also evident in an episode of Bobby's own podcast, where he dialed George during a live recording,
Oh, yeah, I seen
leading
that.
to a
He called
mutual
him.
apology between the two.
I want to apologize
You can't even be serious
for
about
my
it.
behavior on your podcast. I feel like I was a little.
Bobby Lee, you shut your mouth. I'm apologizing to you. I left you. You were our guest.
However, Bobby then retracts his apology, stating that he didn't believe that he was in the wrong.
But I want to pull back my apology then. Because I do. Because I literally did not feel sorry
Many even speculated that George walking out wasn't caused by Bobby himself, but by his own friends openly mocking him and only bringing George into the conversation if it meant that they could shoot jabs at him. Fans would criticize George following this video, calling his behavior unprofessional. People believe that George shouldn't have opened up about something so personal in front of a comedian known for his dark jokes, and as a podcast's host, should have known when to pivot topics and remain lighthearted. What most people don't know is that George has gone on to say that the episode with Bobby had actually been heavily edited in order to make it seem like George was, in his own words, not a comedian, and that the real reason he had walked out had been edited from the episode.
That Bobby Lee episode was edited, and they made me look like I wasn't a comedian that can't take a joke, even though every episode they make jokes on me. And the reason I walked away was definitely not put in there.
Many felt that George was always the odd one out among the hosts. Some would complain that George was too sensitive, accusing him of his jokes falling flat, and that he'd never started discussions.
Sensitive.
George killed the mood with randomly starting a serious conversation. He wasn't expecting them to laugh at him, so maybe that hurt him. Dude should be a life coach instead of a comedian.
Yeah, dude,
He's
you
always
gotta know
giving
when to
insights to
open
life
up,
and not
to
a
be
soul
honest,
asked for it.
guys.
This wasn't just obvious to his fans, but even to
Can't
their own
open up
guests.
to Bobby
One of the
Lee,
most
man.
memorable examples of this was when Shaquille O'Neal,
You
who'd
need
been
to
featured as a
research.
guest, and noticed how quiet George had been for the first 11 minutes of the podcast. Up until this point, George hadn't been adding much to the conversation, most likely because he was trying to find the perfect place to add his own perspectives. However, this ultimately backfired as George would finally bring up a comment, leading to Shaq pointing him out.
Listen, man, I read the Bible a lot when they talk about David and Goliath. I've never seen a giant, and so like I'm literally just, I'm a little
You've
taken.
been sitting over here for 30 minutes and that's all you can freaking say? Fucking kidding me. That's the question. Jeez.
George fell silent for another 11 minutes, in which Shaq would respond by saying this.
What the fuck are you doing here? Ask a question. Jeez.
You do have.
I actually do. I have
Thank
one.
you.
I have one.
Unfortunately, Shaq calling out George wouldn't do much but make him more insecure, so it may be safe to say that Shaq had put a dent in George's self-confidence. And while fans are quick to dismiss George nowadays, this wasn't always the case. Before, fans loved him for being the most mature out of the three and bringing his own charisma and humor to the table, but now it's changed. One such instance occurred when George shared a long monologue in the presence of guest Dane Cook, a moment that seemed to deviate from the natural rhythm of the podcast.
This is getting wordy, but let's
Dane Cook. L.A. guys, L.A.
I'm at a party.
Act 2, the house party.
The response from the audience was mixed, with some expressing that George talked too much about himself to the point where the guests seemed bored. Another episode that highlighted this was one featuring comedian Sebastian Maniscalco. In this particular episode, George's attempts at humor were met with listeners saying that his jokes were falling flat, further fueling the notion that he was finding it difficult to synchronize with the podcast's comedic rhythm. George getting Sebastian to laugh as much as he did is impressive. George is killing me trying so hard to connect with Sebastian and gets shut down every time. And while people used to praise George for being the most level-headed host who wasn't afraid to talk about deeper topics on the show, this would end up becoming his greatest detriment. In some episodes, he would just begin personal discussions in situations that simply did not fit. During a separate episode with guest Andrew Santino,
Oh
George
my
attempted to explain the
God.
situation with Bobby Lee, addressing criticisms and concerns. However, according to viewers,
is like
his
best
explanation
friend.
appeared somewhat defensive, leading to suggestions that he was still grappling with both the incident and its aftermath. And others even pointed out that despite George claiming to be a comedian, he can't seem to take jokes from other comedians. George thinking he's a comedian is his best joke. Imagine letting Bobby Lee hurt your feelings. These were amplified by episode setups that position George away from interactions. Logan and Mike sit together while George is by himself beside the guest. A good comparison can be made with another podcast, Flagrant 2, which shows a more balanced setup where the main host is separated from the supporting hosts. However, on Impulsive, they made George sit in an angle that the guest won't be facing, making it difficult for him to start conversations or engage. Mike is frequently seated next to Logan, a physical arrangement that naturally facilitates direct engagement with the guests. As Logan's right-hand man, this positioning implies a level of equality, as this makes it easier for them to share insights, engage in banter, and contribute in conversation seamlessly. On the other hand, George's seating arrangement is often positioned slightly apart from Logan and Mike, physically separating him from the main flow of discussions. This placement, although it's easy to overlook, can be incredibly significant, as it might create a psychological barrier, making it more challenging for George to initiate conversations, express his thoughts, or feel included in the core interactions. But it wasn't just the guests or being shunned in the middle of episodes that would make George feel like an outsider. It was Logan himself. Watching the podcast, you can see the difference between how Logan treats Mike versus George. When Mike contributes with humor or insights, Logan's
100%.
reactions are generally more positive and encouraging. He often laughs along with Mike's jokes, provides affirmation, and builds on Mike's points, creating a harmonious and cooperative dynamic. This dynamic encourages a comfortable environment for Mike to express himself freely. In contrast, when George shares jokes or insights, Logan's reactions can sometimes be dismissive or even mockingly critical. Instead of fostering a collaborative atmosphere, Logan might interrupt George, make sarcastic remarks, or even redirect the conversation away from George's contributions.
No,
Before
for
you go,
real.
I just want to say,
And that's different.
even I'm sorry to interrupt, George.
While the episode with Bobby Lee played a big part in George's departure from the podcast, it wouldn't be what finally pushes George off the brink. That would later occur in episode 356 of Impulsive, where Logan would openly mock George's Christian beliefs.
Genuinely, like, I know people that hate me, that treat me better about my faith than you, and you're my best friend.
I just am definitely questioning why we have to perpetuate a belief that is fucking silly.
Eventually, George attempted to steer the conversation back on track, noting that nobody else would be willing to have a conversation about this topic. However, the damage had already been done. The backlash towards Logan was swift, with comments stating how much they've lost respect for Logan and pointed out how disrespectful he was towards George's beliefs. The amount of respect I've lost for Logan is crazy.
Yeah, that's
Logan
kinda
really
crazy.
grossed me out in this episode. He was so disrespectful towards George's beliefs. Logan's comments opened up discussions about his ego and his inclination to be right at the expense of others' feelings. Because of this, clips began circulating online, with people criticizing the way Mike and Logan had treated George, while also remarking that they'd lost respect for Logan. This episode would pave the way towards George's gradual disappearance from the Impulsive podcast until he parted ways for good without any warning. When Mike Majlak was asked to detail the situation between George and Impulsive, this is what Mike had to say.
Wait, Mike, I have no idea what's going on. I don't think a lot of Mike does. Why is Georgie not an Impulsive anymore? Is that like you don't answer that?
He's too Christian.
He's too Christian.
Okay.
But this isn't the end of the story. During episode 380 of Impulsive, long after George had left the podcast, Logan seemed to direct a few more taunts at George. This included a segment where Logan's comment about views was muted, and fans quickly inferred it
He's
was
too
about George,
Christian.
which prompted them to
Fucking
share
sneak
tweets
up,
and
bro.
clips via social media, hoping to garner George's attention.
People watch, and without people watching, I just have a show like
Which shows that even without George having anything to do with their lives, they still find ways to make fun of him.
Wait, what'd he
George
say?
eventually addressed the situation with a tweet posted on the 5th of May saying, "To the Impulsive fans, I'm so sorry I can't speak about things. I do love you guys, and for those of you sending me the clip of them talking I've already moved on from that toxic environment." And when looking at Impulsive's history with their third hosts, it's evident that there's a pattern forming, and it's that all of their third hosts had ended up leaving. Their first co-host, Spencer, would go on to move to Hawaii, with their second co-host, Mac's departure, being the topic of controversy as well, due to how many believe that it was because of Mike's belittling of him that made him leave, almost similar to George's case. This incident marked a departure from the image of Logan that had seemingly matured over the years, leaving many surprised. With Logan's CryptoZoo scam now being brought to light, it's only painting a clearer picture in his fans' eyes that Logan isn't the person that he appears to be. Many had even believed that Logan had finally changed and improved during the course of the years, but with these recent situations, fans are beginning to feel like this isn't the case at all. That Logan would gladly mock his own co-host and scam millions of people.
That's a whole
at the same
fucked up
time.
situation,
George
to be
Janko would go on
honest.
to be another part of Logan Paul's long history of controversy.
Shopify
That
has
was a whole-
everything you need to
that was a
grow your
crazy
retail
video
business,
right there,
like
ain't gonna
fast and
lie.
secure checkout, reliable card readers.
Alright, guys. The fuck? Why isn't this shit ending?